The temperature on the digital sign outside Hargrove Properties read 12 degrees Fahrenheit when Victor Hargrove threw the deadbolt and walked away. On the front stoop of 414 Millbrook Lane, Sarah Calloway stood in her nursing scrubs. She hadn't even had time to grab her coat, holding her 8-year-old son Danny against her chest. The boy was wearing pajamas printed with little rocket ships. His sneakers were unlaced. He hadn't finished tying them when the knocking started, and then things happened very fast. The door to the house they'd lived in for 4 years was locked behind them. Her furniture was visible through the front window. A contractor was already moving her photographs off the hallway table. The patrol car at the curb, Deputy Dale Briggs at the wheel, engine idling, showed no sign of moving. Sarah looked at her son. Danny looked up at her with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin and a question in his face that she didn't know how to answer. "Mom," he said. His breath made a small pale cloud in the frozen air. "I'm cold." "I know, baby." She pulled him tighter. "I know." She started making calls. Her co-worker didn't pick up. Her neighbor Linda Morrow came to the window, looked at Sarah and Danny on the stoop, and drew the curtains closed. The temperature was 12 degrees and falling. And then she heard it. At first she thought it was a truck convoy. The sound built slowly, not suddenly, like a weather front rolling in from the west, low and deliberate. The specific bass frequency of large displacement engines that you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. It grew and didn't stop growing. She didn't know it yet, but 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days of doing the right thing were about to pay off in the most unexpected way imaginable. She just had to survive the next 20 minutes of cold. People who knew Sarah Calloway always said the same thing about her. She never complained. Not when Tommy died. Not when the Army sent a chaplain to the door of this very house on a gray Tuesday morning in March, 3 years ago, to tell her that Staff Sergeant Thomas Calloway had been killed in a training accident at Fort Bragg. A freak thing, a vehicle rollover, the kind of death that didn't make the news or generate a folded flag ceremony, because it wasn't combat. Just bad luck. Just the universe showing once again that it played by nobody's rules. Not when the Army's life insurance took 8 months to process. Not when the medical bills from Tommy's final hospitalization arrived like winter itself. Cold, relentless, impossible to stop. Not when she had to go back to work at Mercy General Hospital 12 days after the funeral because the mortgage payment didn't mourn alongside her. Sarah Calloway was 34 years old, 5'4", with dark circles under green eyes that had witnessed too many 12-hour shifts and not enough sleep. She was the kind of woman who packed an extra granola bar in her bag for the homeless man outside the hospital entrance, who stayed 20 minutes past her shift in to hold the hand of a patient who had no family to call. The nurses she worked with called her a saint, and she laughed it off every time, because saints didn't burn their macaroni and cheese or forget parent-teacher conference night. But she never complained. She just worked. Tommy had been meticulous about paperwork the way military people often are. He taught her, in the early years of their marriage, that documentation was armor, that the world was mostly fair but occasionally wasn't, and that when it wasn't, paper was what you had. So Sarah had her rent receipts organized in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer. She had bank statements going back for years. She had every email, every certified letter receipt, every maintenance request, and the dated response to it. If she ever needed to demonstrate that she had been a model tenant, she could do so in approximately 90 seconds. She had paid her rent on time every single month. She had the receipts to prove it. The house on Millbrook Lane was small but right. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where the second burner ran a little hot, a backyard that Danny had claimed as his personal kingdom complete with a fort constructed from salvaged timber, and an apple tree that tilted at a characteristic angle that they had named Old Lean. When Tommy was alive, they'd rented it from a landlord named Gareth Phillips, a decent old man who fixed things when they broke and never raised the rent without a conversation first. When Gareth passed away 2 summers ago, his daughter inherited the property and promptly sold the entire portfolio to a development company called Hargrove Properties LLC. Victor Hargrove had shown up 6 months later with new lease agreements, new rules, and a smile like a man who already knew how the story ended. What Hargrove knew, and what Sarah didn't, was that a hotel company from Atlanta had approached him with a development contract worth $4.2 million. They wanted to build a boutique property on the Millbrook stretch. They needed 8 adjacent lots. 7 were already in Hargrove's pocket. 414, Millbrook Lane was the last piece. And Sarah Calloway, with her on-time rent and her manila folder and her carefully organized life, was standing in the way. It started on a Monday. Sarah came home from a night shift at 7 in the morning to find a notice taped to the front door. Notice of eviction, failure to pay rent. The paper had the Hargrove Properties letterhead. It cited 3 months of unpaid rent totaling $4,200. It stated that she had 5 days to vacate the premises or law enforcement would be called. Sarah read it 3 times standing on the porch in her scrubs, her brain still half-fogged from the overnight shift. Then she went inside, made coffee, and started making phone calls. She called Hargrove Properties and got a receptionist who told her Victor Hargrove wasn't available. She left a message. She called the county clerk's office and was placed on hold for 40 minutes. She called a legal aid hotline and got an automated system that told her wait times were currently 2 to 3 weeks. She called Hargrove Properties again and this time got a property manager named Craig who spoke in the smooth, practiced tone of someone trained to say nothing useful. I understand your concern, Miss Calloway, but our records show the account is delinquent. You would need to dispute that directly with Mr. Hargrove. The 5 days passed in a blur of unreturned calls and closed doors. The legal aid office finally responded by email, 2 weeks too late, with a form letter and a list of resources. The county clerk told her she could file a dispute, but processing took 30 to 60 days. On day 6, Victor Hargrove came himself. He arrived at 9 in the morning in a black Mercedes, wearing a charcoal overcoat and the expression of a man who had done this before. Deputy Dale Briggs arrived 3 minutes later in a patrol car, as though the timing had been choreographed, which, as Sarah would later discover, it had been. Miss Calloway. Hargrove's voice was almost gentle, the way a scalpel is almost kind before it cuts. I'm sorry it's come to this. I have paid every month, Sarah said. She held up the folder. I have proof right here. Our accounting department has reviewed the records extensively. Hargrove didn't even glance at the folder. The discrepancy stands. What discrepancy? These are bank statements. Deputy Briggs is here to assist with the transition. Hargrove gestured toward the patrol car. I've arranged for a storage unit to hold your belongings until the situation is resolved through proper channels. You're welcome to contest this legally, of course. Danny appeared at the doorway behind Sarah, still in his rocket ship pajamas, holding a juice box. He looked at the men on the porch with the wide, uncertain eyes of a child who didn't understand exactly what was happening, but understood that something was wrong. Sarah looked at her son. She looked at Victor Hargrove, who was already checking his phone. She looked at Deputy Briggs, who was studying the middle distance with deliberate unconcern. She thought about fighting. She thought about screaming. She thought about the legal aid email with the form letter and the 30 to 60-day processing time. You have until I finish this call, Hargrove said, the phone already at his ear, and turned away. 15 minutes later, Sarah and Danny stood on the front stoop in the December cold, the deadbolt turning behind them with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The manila folder was in her hands. Her phone was in her pocket. Her coat was inside. Danny looked up at her. His breath came in small, pale clouds. His hands were already turning red. Mom, he said, I'm cold. I know, baby. She pulled him against her side. I know. She started making calls again. Judy didn't pick up, probably asleep after a night shift. Linda Morrow came to her window, looked at Sarah and Danny on the stoop, and drew the curtains closed. The legal aid hotline gave her the automated system again, 12 degrees, and the sound of engines. She thought at first it was a truck convoy, the kind that sometimes moved through town on the way to the industrial park on Route 9. The sound built slowly, not suddenly, like a storm rolling in from the west, that specific base frequency of large displacement engines that you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. Danny heard it too. He lifted his head from her side. What is that? He asked. They saw them first as headlights, a double row of white points moving through the gray morning like a slow-burning comet, and then the shapes resolved. Motorcycles, big ones, Harleys and Indians and customs that looked like they'd been assembled by people who understood machinery the way surgeons understood bodies. 14 of them, maybe 16. They came down Millbrook Lane in a slow, rolling formation that somehow managed to be both completely casual and entirely deliberate. the way a parade is both festive and a demonstration of presence. They wore black leather vests with a patch on the back, a wolf's head rendered in white and silver, jaw open, eyes fierce, and below it the words Iron Wolves MC. Below that, a bottom rocker, Vermont. At the front of the column rode a man on a black Harley Road King that had been modified so extensively it barely resembled its factory origin. He was big, not just tall but wide, the kind of wide that came from years of physical work rather than a gym, with forearms like bridge cables visible where his jacket pushed up at the wrist. His face was weathered and angular, framed by a gray-shot beard, and under the open face helmet his eyes were the particular shade of gray that matched the December sky perfectly. Marcus Webb, known to the Iron Wolves and most of central Vermont as Iron, brought his bike to a stop at the foot of 414 Millbrook Lane's driveway and looked at the woman and the boy on the porch. His jaw tightened. Behind him, 15 motorcycles coasted to a quiet stop in sequence, engines idling, filling Millbrook Lane with that deep, rumbling breath. Deputy Briggs' patrol car was still at the curb. Dale Briggs was now sitting very upright in his seat, both hands conspicuously visible, studying the motorcycles with the expression of a man rapidly and extensively recalculating his morning. Marcus Webb swung off his bike with the practiced ease of a man who'd been doing it for 30 years and walked up the driveway. He stopped 10 feet from the porch. His boots left clean, deliberate imprints in the thin skin of snow on the pavement. He looked at Sarah for a long moment. "Are you Sarah Calloway?" he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. She stared at him. "Yes, Tommy Calloway's wife." Something moved through her at the name. It always did, like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples spreading outward from the place where the stone first touched. "His widow," she said. "Yes." Marcus nodded slowly. He looked at the boy, then at the locked door behind them, then at the patrol car at the curb. He looked at Sarah's arms wrapped around Danny's shoulders and the folder in her hands and the nursing scrubs she was wearing in 12-degree weather and the small red hands of her son. "I'm Marcus Webb," he said. "Tommy and I knew each other. I'll explain all of that. But first," he turned to the big man who'd stepped up beside him, a stocky man with a thick black mustache and a Diesel road name patch on his vest. "Diesel, get the boy something warm." Diesel Rodriguez was already shrugging out of his leather jacket. He had a heavy flannel shirt underneath and a thermos that appeared from somewhere inside his saddlebag with the efficiency of a man prepared for contingencies. He walked toward Danny with the careful, non-threatening body language of a large man who understood that children needed to be approached slowly, the way you approach a fire, close enough to give warmth, not so close as to frighten. "Hey kid," he said, crouching. "You like hot chocolate?" Danny looked at his mother. Sarah, still holding her breath, gave the smallest nod. "Yeah," Danny said. "I do." There was a bar called the Ironwood Tap 12 miles outside of town, on a county road flanked by birch trees that turned gold in October and skeletal white in December. The Iron Wolves had been using the back room for meetings since before Marcus Webb became president. The owner, an ex-Marine named Pete, whose brother, Patch, rode with the club, kept the coffee strong and the questions minimal, which were the only two requirements for a good meeting space. 3 hours after arriving on Millbrook Lane, after the hot chocolate and Marcus's conversation with Sarah on the porch, and the moment when Deputy Dale Briggs, looking at 16 motorcycles and a small boy with a thermos, had made the quietly sensible decision to drive away. They sat in the back room of the Ironwood Tap. Sarah and Danny on one side of the table, Marcus and Diesel and a thin, sharp-eyed man named Wrench Davis on the other. "Tommy came to us about 2 years before he died," Marcus said. He held his coffee cup in both hands, not drinking, just holding it. He was on a National Guard rotation, stationed temporarily at Devon's, and his truck broke down on Route 12. Wrench found him on the shoulder. Wrench nodded. "Alternator. Fixed it in 30 minutes. He bought us beer afterward. We talked." Marcus continued. "He was good people. We kept in touch across the years." He paused, looking at the table. "When he got deployment orders to Fort Bragg, he came to us with something." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew an envelope. It was plain legal paper, tan, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Sarah's name was written on the front in handwriting she recognized like a body remembers its own heartbeat. Tommy's handwriting. Her breath caught in her throat. He asked me to hold this for him, Marcus said. He set the envelope on the table and slid it carefully toward her. He said, "If something happens to me, find my wife. Give this to her." He said he hoped she'd never need it, but that she should have it if she did. A beat of quiet. He said you were the kind of person who did everything right and trusted the world to be fair, and that the world sometimes needed a reminder. Sarah looked at the envelope. Her hands weren't quite steady when she picked it up. Inside was a document, a property deed. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. The legal language was dense, but the facts resolved clearly enough. Tommy, prior to their marriage, before Sarah was involved in the property at all, had entered into a private purchase agreement with Gareth Phillips for 414 Millbrook Lane. The agreement had been drawn up by a local attorney named Raymond Cho, notarized, and filed with the county recorder's office. Tommy had made installment payments over 3 years before his death. At the time of his passing, the property was 60% paid. And when Gareth Phillips' daughter had sold the portfolio to Hargrove Properties, she had sold property that was not entirely hers to sell, because Tommy Calloway had a recorded purchase agreement and a payment history that predated the sale by years. Victor Hargrove's legal team had found the technical gap. The purchase agreement had not been converted to a formal recorded deed before Tommy's death, leaving it in a legal gray zone. They had proceeded on the assumption that a grieving widow with limited resources would not have the documentation, the knowledge, or the means to challenge it. They had been right about 2 of those 3 things. What they hadn't accounted for was Tommy Calloway's habit of meticulous documentation, a marine-grade waterproof envelope in a biker club safe, and the fact that Victor Hargrove had just thrown a nurse into the snow on the wrong December morning. Sarah read the deed twice. Then she set it down on the table very carefully. "He bought the house," she said quietly. The words didn't quite fit in her mouth yet. "He was buying it. The whole time. He never told me. He wanted to surprise you," Marcus said. His voice had dropped to something gentler now. Carefully gentle, the way a large man is gentle with something that might break. "He talked about it. Said he was going to finish the payments and give you the deed on your anniversary." He looked at his coffee. He didn't get to. The room was quiet. Danny, who had been coloring on a paper placemat with a pen Diesel had produced from somewhere, looked up at his mother. He saw her face. He put the pen down and climbed off his chair and came to stand beside her, pressing his small warmth against her arm. "Mom," he said. She put her arm around him. She didn't trust her voice yet. It was Marcus who broke the silence. "Raymond Cho is our legal counsel," he said, his voice returning to its steady register. "He's reviewed the documents. The purchase agreement is valid and recorded. Hargrove's title search missed, or ignored, the county recording. Combined with his fraudulent eviction based on fabricated rent delinquency, Raymond says we have a strong case." He paused. "But I didn't come here just with a legal case, Sarah." She looked at him. "3 years ago," he said, "you were working in the ICU at Mercy General. Night shift. A man came in off a motorcycle accident on the highway, lost control after a road rager opened fire, went over the guardrail. Trauma team was overwhelmed. You were the only one there for the first 14 minutes. She knew before he finished. That was you, she said. That was me. He tilted his head. I was unconscious for most of it. But afterward, the attending, Dr. Reyes, told me that the nurse who stabilized me before the trauma team arrived was the reason I made it to surgery. She stayed calm when she should have panicked. She made the right calls. She did not leave. His gray eyes held her steadily. I tried to find you afterward. I didn't have a name. We're not supposed to discuss patients. I know. I asked around anyway. A corner of his mouth moved, barely. Bikers are patient when it matters. Took about 8 months to get your name. He leaned forward slightly. I owe you my life, Sarah Calloway. And you don't even know what you did, because you do that kind of thing every single day and call it your job. He straightened. Today is not your day to be standing in the snow. Raymond Cho arrived at the Ironwood Tap at noon in a gray suit that looked slightly incongruous among the Iron Wolves' leather and flannel, but he moved through the room with the comfort of a man long accustomed to operating at the intersection of outlaw culture and precise legal procedure, which was an unusual skill set and a valuable one. He spread the documents on the table, and walked Sarah through them with the careful precision of a man who loved his work. The purchase agreement between Tommy Calloway and Gareth Phillips was dated 7 years prior. It had been executed before witnesses, filed at the Washington County Recorder's Office, and sitting in the public record database this entire time. Invisible to Sarah because she hadn't known to look for it, and invisible to Hargrove because his title research team had either missed it or suppressed it. Raymond believed suppressed. "When I pulled the chain of title this morning," Raymond said, laying out a printed document, "I found something interesting. Hargrove's title search was conducted by a firm called Meridian Title Partners. Meridian issued a clean title certificate 8 months ago, which is what Hargrove used to complete the acquisition. But Meridian's search should have found the Calloway recording. It's right there in the county database. The only way you miss it is if you're specifically looking past it." Deliberately, Sarah said, "That's what discovery will determine." Raymond allowed himself a small, precise smile. "But fraudulent title certification, plus fraudulent eviction proceedings, plus forged rent delinquency documentation? We have a civil fraud case here that would make Hargrove's $4.2 million hotel deal look very expensive indeed." Sarah absorbed this. She thought about the last 3 years, the overtime shifts, the careful budgeting, the quiet evenings in Danny's room reading to him because the TV service had been disconnected 6 months ago, because she was saving every possible dollar. She thought about the 15 minutes she'd spent on that frozen porch watching Dale Briggs sit in his patrol car and do nothing, while Danny's hands turned red in the cold. Something crystallized in her chest. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more absolute. The particular feeling of a person who has been treated as though they have no recourse discovering that they do. "What do we need to do?" she said. "First, I file an emergency motion to void the eviction," Raymond said. "Given the fraudulent nature of the proceedings, I expect to obtain a temporary restraining order requiring Hargrove to restore your possession by end of business today. I've already prepared the filing." "Today," Sarah said. "Judge Miriam Lott owes me a professional courtesy," Raymond said mildly. "And she does not like Victor Hargrove. He had her parking spot towed last spring. He gathered the papers into a neat stack. The legal piece I have handled. The other piece," he nodded at Marcus, "is yours." Marcus Webb stood. He zipped his jacket. Around him, like a tide rising, unhurried, inevitable. The other members of the Iron Wolves also stood, leather creaking, boots finding the floor. Diesel finished the last of his coffee. Wrench pulled on his gloves. Patch, the sergeant-at-arms, looked at the door with the focused expression of a man who has been waiting for something to do and is satisfied to finally have something to do. "Let's ride," Marcus said. The thing about 16 motorcycles in formation, moving through a small Vermont town on a December afternoon, was that it was impossible to ignore. Not in a threatening way. The Iron Wolves kept careful speed, obeyed every traffic signal, used their turn signals with a diligence that would have satisfied any traffic examiner, but in the way that weather is impossible to ignore. You felt it before you saw it. You stopped what you were doing and looked. People came to windows. A man walking his dog stopped and stood, his dog sitting down beside him as if in solidarity. The owner of the diner on Route 12 came to the glass door with a coffee pot still in his hand and watched. A group of teenagers outside the pharmacy raised their phones. Sarah rode in Marcus's truck, a black Ram 2500 that he drove when weather demanded it, with Danny between her and the center console. Raymond Cho followed in his own car. Diesel and Patch led the bike column. Danny, who had started the morning frightened and cold, was now craning his neck to look back at the motorcycles through the truck's rear window with the barely contained wonder of a boy who has just discovered that the world is larger and stranger than he'd estimated. "Are those guys our friends?" he asked. "I think they are," Sarah said. "Are they like a gang?" Marcus, eyes on the road, said, "We're a club." Danny considered this. "What's the difference?" "A gang does what's good for the gang," Marcus said. "A club does what's good for people." Danny thought about it. "Is that actually true?" "It's what we try for," Marcus said. He glanced sideways at Danny with the fleeting, unguarded expression of a man who didn't smile easily and sometimes forgot not to. "We're better at it some days than others." They turned onto Millbrook Lane. Victor Hargrove's black Mercedes was still in the driveway of 414. He'd been inside meeting with contractors. Sarah's furniture was visible through the front window, being inventoried for transition. A panel van from a property management company was parked at the curb. The formation of motorcycles came around the corner and coasted to a stop, filling the street, engines settling into that collective idle that sounded like a sleeping giant. The sound rolled across the quiet residential block with the authority of something that didn't need to announce itself. Victor Hargrove heard it. He came to the front window. He looked out at 16 motorcycles and a black Ram truck and a neat man in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. All stopped in front of the property he had fraudulently seized that morning. His face went through several expressions in quick succession, none of them comfortable. Marcus Webb did not slam doors. He did not raise his voice. He did not do any of the things that Victor Hargrove might reasonably have anticipated from a man in a motorcycle club president's patch arriving at your doorstep with 15 companions on a December afternoon. He knocked 3 times, evenly spaced. The door was opened by one of the contractors, who took one look at Marcus Webb filling the doorframe. Those gray eyes, that measured stillness, those 30 years of living in his face, and stepped aside without a word. Marcus stepped into the house that belonged to Sarah Calloway and looked around with quiet assessment, the way a man takes stock of a room before deciding what needs doing in it. Sarah's photographs were on the hallway table, moved to one side, but not yet boxed. Her coat was on the hook by the door. Danny's backpack hung below it. Everything ordinary. Everything that should have been untouchable. Victor Hargrove stood in the hallway in his charcoal overcoat, phone in hand, the practiced composure of a man accustomed to controlling rooms already developing fracture lines. He was flanked by his property manager Craig, who had gone several shades past pale. "Mr. Hargrove," Raymond Cho said, stepping forward past Marcus with the smooth precision of a man who understood that paperwork, deployed correctly, was its own variety of blunt instrument. "Raymond Cho, attorney at law, I have several documents that require your immediate attention." He set his briefcase on the hallway table, Sarah's hallway table, and opened it with the unhurried confidence of a man holding all the cards and content to reveal them one at a time. The first document was the restraining order, signed by Judge Miriam Lott at 11:47 a.m. that morning, ordering the immediate cessation of eviction proceedings at 414 Millbrook Lane and the restoration of Sarah Calloway's possession pending hearing. Hargrove read it. His jaw tightened. "This is a misrepresentation." "The second document," Raymond said, laying another page precisely on top, "is a copy of the original purchase agreement between Thomas E. Calloway and Gareth R. Phillips, filed and recorded at Washington County Recorder's Office 7 years and 4 months ago, establishing Thomas Calloway as a partial owner of this property through documented installment payments. The agreement predates your acquisition by years. Your title search, conducted by Meridian Title Partners, failed to disclose this recording, which constitutes potential fraud in the transfer of real property under Vermont statute." Hargrove's eyes moved to the document. Something changed in his face, a tightening that was almost imperceptible but entirely legible to anyone watching carefully. The look of a man who has just confirmed that what he hoped was a manageable problem is, in fact, structural. "Additionally," Raymond said, producing a third document with the same unhurried precision, "I have obtained Ms. Calloway's complete rent payment records from both her personal bank and, interestingly, from Hargrove Properties' own account management system, the login credentials for which were provided to me this morning by a former Hargrove Properties employee who has agreed to cooperate fully with any subsequent investigation." He paused. "Every payment was made, Mr. Hargrove, on time, every month, for the entire duration of Ms. Calloway's tenancy. The delinquency documentation that formed the basis of this morning's eviction was fabricated. That constitutes civil fraud. Depending on Deputy Briggs' level of knowing participation in executing a fraudulent eviction, it may also constitute criminal conspiracy." Raymond closed his briefcase. "I would recommend you call your attorney." Silence settled over the hallway of 414, Millbrook Lane, like the snow settling outside. The contractors had quietly assembled in the living room doorway. Nobody was inventorying anything. Nobody was touching anything. Hargrove looked at the documents. He looked at Raymond Cho. He looked at Marcus Webb, who was standing with his arms folded and his feet at shoulder width and the expression of a man who had nowhere else to be and the patience of a person who has never needed to be anywhere in a hurry because the world eventually came to him. "I'd like to call my attorney," Hargrove said. Please, Raymond said. We'll wait. Marcus turned to the doorway. Sarah and Danny had come in from the truck. Sarah was standing in the hallway of her home, and she was looking at the photograph of Tommy that sat on her table, that the contractors had moved to the side but not yet packed. She picked it up with both hands and held it carefully, the way you hold things that are irreplaceable. Danny, standing at her hip, tugged Marcus's sleeve. Marcus looked down at him. Is it going to be okay? Danny asked. His voice was the voice of a child who had been carrying that question internally for a very long time and had finally decided it was safe to ask it out loud. Marcus crouched down so he was at eye level with the boy. He looked at Danny Calloway. This boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin and his rocket ship pajamas and his unlaced sneakers and 8 years of life that contained more than it should at 8. And he thought about Tommy Calloway pulling over on Route 12 in a broken-down truck and accepting help from strangers and buying beer and somehow becoming someone worth knowing, worth trusting, worth holding on to across years and distances and all the things that life throws. Between people, he thought about lying in a trauma bay 3 years ago with Sarah Calloway's hands steady on his chest, making the calls that kept him alive until the team arrived. He thought about the fact that good people actually existed in the world, not as a category, not as a concept, but as specific real humans who drove broken-down trucks and worked night shifts and paid their rent on time and saved strangers' lives without registering it as remarkable, because to them it simply wasn't remarkable. It was just the thing you did. He thought about the fact that this, more than anything else, was worth riding 16 motorcycles onto a residential street in December 4. Yeah, kid, Marcus said. It's going to be okay. Hargrove's attorney arrived 40 minutes later. A sharp-faced man named Whitmore who spent 20 increasingly uncomfortable minutes reviewing the documents at the kitchen table while Hargrove paced the living room and the Iron Wolf stood around outside in the cold with the equanimity of men professionally comfortable with waiting. Diesel had found the coffee maker and brewed a pot. He brought a cup to Sarah without being asked and set it on the counter beside her without ceremony, then returned to the window. She held it with both hands and stood looking out at the motorcycles in the street and thought about the strangeness of the universe, its capacity for putting exactly the right things in exactly the wrong-seeming places at exactly the right moment. She thought about the night she'd worked on the motorcycle accident. She remembered it differently than Marcus had described it. She'd been working a double, 12 hours already in her body, that particular variety of exhaustion that makes every sensation slightly muted, when the trauma bay doors opened and the paramedics came through hot. GSW plus traumatic crash injuries, blood pressure cratering, the trauma attending 20 minutes out on another case. Sarah had looked at the man on the gurney, large, gray-bearded, as tough as cable wire, even unconscious, and simply done what she'd been trained to do. There was no calculation. There was no heroism. There was just, this person is dying, here is what needs to happen, begin. She did not think of it as remarkable. She thought of it as a Tuesday. She thought about Tommy, in his meticulous and quiet way, protecting her from beyond his own death, knowing something about the world's imperfect fairness and doing something concrete about it, finding a motorcycle club on a county road and recognizing in them, what? Reliability, loyalty, the willingness to hold something important for someone who needed it held. She thought about how well Tommy had always read people. In the kitchen, Whitmore closed his briefcase. His voice was low, but in the small house it carried clearly. Victor, he said, we need to talk about settlement. The negotiations took the better part of 3 hours. During this time, Marcus ordered pizza from the place on Route 12, and the Iron Wolves ate it standing around their bikes in the cold with the focused efficiency of men untroubled by December temperatures. Danny, who had been given permission to go outside and examine the motorcycles, was sitting on Diesel's fat bob with the reverent expression of someone who has been permitted to touch something sacred. Does it go fast? Danny asked. Fast enough, Diesel said. How fast? Diesel considered this seriously. Faster than your mom would like, he said solemnly. Danny nodded as though this were precisely the answer he'd expected. Inside, Raymond Cho laid out the geometry of Victor Hargrove's situation with the meticulous patience of a man who had built this argument brick by brick and was now, calmly and thoroughly, taking the building apart in front of its owner. The fraudulent eviction, the suppressed title record, the forged delinquency documentation, The $4.2 million development motive that connected every decision. A cooperative former employee prepared to testify. A plaintiff who was a nurse, a widow, and a mother of a child who had stood in unlaced sneakers in the snow. Against this, Raymond laid out what settlement could look like versus what litigation would look like, in time, in cost, in publicity, in the kind of investigative attention that a story about a man throwing a widow and her 8-year-old son into 12-degree weather tended to attract. Victor Hargrove was not a stupid man. He was a greedy one, which was different, and which did not preclude understanding when a situation had become geometrically inescapable. By late afternoon, the terms were agreed. Hargrove Properties would execute a quitclaim deed transferring full ownership of 414 Millbrook Lane to Sarah Calloway, clear of any encumbrance, in recognition of the valid purchase agreement and payments made by Thomas Calloway. Additionally, Hargrove Properties would pay a settlement sum of $42,000, a figure Raymond had selected with the precision of a man who understood the value of symbolic arithmetic, representing 12 months of rent payments, estimated wages lost to the proceedings, and damages for emotional harm to Sarah and Danny Calloway. Raymond also handed Hargrove's attorney a sealed envelope. That, Raymond said, is a summary of the evidence regarding Meridian Title Partners' failure to disclose the Calloway recording. We are not filing this with the state's attorney today. Whether we do so in the future depends entirely on whether your client demonstrates the wisdom to stay away from Sarah Calloway, her property, and her son permanently and completely. Whitmore took the envelope without comment. Victor Hargrove signed the documents at 4:47 p.m. He did not look at Sarah when he left. He walked out of the house that was no longer his to walk out of, got into his black Mercedes, and drove in the direction of everything he'd accumulated and all the ways it had just become considerably more expensive. Deputy Dale Briggs received a different kind of visitor that evening, a representative from the State Attorney General's office, responding to a complaint filed by Raymond Cho that afternoon regarding his knowing participation in the execution of a fraudulent eviction order. That investigation would take several months. Its conclusion was not kind to Dale Briggs. By 5 o'clock, the contractors were gone, and the house was Sarah's again. Was Sarah's in a way it had never quite been before. In a way she felt physically, a kind of settled solidity under her feet as she walked through each room and touched each familiar thing and let the fact of it move through her body like warmth returning to cold hands. Danny ran upstairs and came down 5 minutes later to report, with the gravity of a field inspector, that everything was exactly where he'd left it. His dinosaurs, his chapter books, the model airplane he and Tommy had built the summer before Tommy died, which Sarah had repaired 3 times since, and which sat on the shelf above his desk like a small, persistent flag. "It's all here," he said. "They didn't move anything." "Good," Sarah said. The Iron Wolves were getting ready to ride. They moved around each other with the practiced ease of people who had done this many times, checking gear, starting engines in sequence, the group assembling itself from individuals into a unit as naturally as a flock taking flight. There was no fanfare. There was no ceremony. They were simply there, and then they were preparing not to be there, and both states had the same quality of unhurried purpose. Sarah went outside. Marcus was at his bike, checking something in his saddlebag. He straightened when she came down the porch steps. "Marcus," she said. He looked at her. She had thought about what to say during the settlement negotiations, during the waiting, during the 3 hours in the back room of the Ironwood Tap, when she'd been trying to process all of it simultaneously. She had thought about what it meant to be owed something and to have it repaid unexpectedly, about the architecture of debt and gratitude and the way they moved through years like water through rock, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly there was a canyon where before there had been solid stone. "I did my job," she said. 3 years ago. I want you to know that. I didn't do anything special. I did what I'm trained to do for anyone who needed it." "I know," Marcus said. "I don't want you to feel like you owed me this." "I don't," he said simply. "Tommy was our brother, not patched, but our brother. You're his wife. Danny is his son. That's what we're here for." He paused. "The rest, the ICU, 3 years ago, that's mine. I carry that separate from this. Those are 2 different things." He looked at her steadily. "You're allowed to have saved my life, Sarah. You don't have to make it smaller just to feel comfortable with it." She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known she was holding. "Thank you," she said. Just that. It was enough. He nodded once. He pulled on his gloves. Raymond will call you Monday about the deed filing. Should be fully recorded by end of next week. He swung onto the road, King. You need anything between now and then, you call the club number. Diesel will pick up. Okay, she said. He turned the key. The engine caught and settled into its deep, steady pulse. That sound that had rolled into the street at 12 degrees this morning and was now rolling out of it in the amber light of a December afternoon, having done what it came to do. Danny appeared at the porch railing. Bye, Diesel, he yelled. Diesel, already on his bike at the front of the column, looked back over his shoulder. He raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave, the kind of wave that meant, I see you, kid. We'll be around. The column pulled out, one by one, then together. The engine notes blended into that single deep chord that was not really a sound anymore, but a feeling, a vibration in the air and the pavement and the sternum, growing smaller as they rounded the corner and headed back toward the county road. Sarah stood in the driveway and watched them go. Danny came to stand beside her and slipped his hand into hers. They watched until the sound faded entirely. Mom, Danny said. Dad bought us the house. She squeezed his hand. He did, without even telling you. Yep, that's kind of a lot. Yeah, Sarah said softly. That's kind of a lot. The last of the engine's sound dissolved into the December air. The street returned to its residential quiet. The Christmas lights on Linda Morrow's porch. Linda, who had drawn her curtains that morning and would have difficulty meeting Sarah's eyes for approximately 6 months afterward, blinked their cheerful, oblivious sequence. Sarah and Danny stood in the driveway of their home. Their home. The word had new weight now, new density, the way words sometimes do when the thing they describe becomes more real than you thought it was. Cold, Danny said after a moment. Very, Sarah agreed. We should go inside. We should. Neither of them moved for another few seconds. Then Danny laughed. That sudden, uncomplicated laugh of an 8-year-old that doesn't require a reason and doesn't need one, and pulled her toward the door. The document arrived on a Thursday, 9 days later. It came by certified mail in a thick official envelope from the Washington County Recorder's Office, stamped and final and bearing the particular authority of things that have been made permanent in the public record. Sarah opened it at the kitchen table while Danny was at school, and the second burner ran a little hot under the coffee pot, and the morning light came through the kitchen window in that clean, specific way it had in December when the sun was low. Warranty deed, 414, Millbrook Lane, Harlow, Vermont. Owner of record, Sarah E. Calloway. She read it once, carefully. She put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where the manila folder still lived, full of rent receipts that were no longer necessary but felt important to keep. Armor that had served its purpose. She kept it anyway, because Tommy had taught her that documentation was armor, and Tommy had been right about most things. Then she poured her coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and cried. Not from sadness, or not only sadness. She cried the way you cry when something has been held in for a long time, and the container finally changes shape to accommodate it. When relief and grief and gratitude all arrive at once, and there is no order to impose on them, and no reason to try. She cried for Tommy and for the house he'd been buying her, and for the fact that she'd never known until now, never suspected, had simply lived in this house for 4 years in the ordinary way, while underneath the surface of everything Tommy's love had been quietly doing its work. She cried for 3 years of night shifts and tight budgets and a disciplined, careful life of a person who knows they have no margin for error. She cried for Danny in his rocket ship pajamas on the frozen porch. She cried for Marcus Webb's gray eyes telling her you're allowed to have saved my life. She cried for approximately 10 minutes. Then she blew her nose, drank her coffee, and opened her laptop. She had a shift at Mercy General in 4 hours. There were patient notes to review. There was a 62-year-old man who'd come in 2 days ago with cardiac arrhythmia. No family listed in his file, which meant someone needed to be with him when the test results came back, needed to sit with him and explain what they meant in plain language and make sure he wasn't alone with the information. Sarah Calloway was 34 years old and owned her home outright, and had a son who laughed without needing a reason and a drawer full of important documents and a motorcycle club's number saved in her phone. She had work to do. She opened her notes and began. The Iron Wolves held their annual spring run the first weekend in May, when the Vermont roads dried out and the birches put on their first tentative green and the whole world smelled like cold water and beginning again. This year, at the end of the run, they stopped at 414 Millbrook Lane. Diesel had called ahead. Sarah had made sandwiches, approximately 30 of them, which had seemed like overkill until she counted 16 hungry bikers and revised her estimate as too conservative. Danny had made a sign on poster board that said "Welcome Iron Wolves" in red and black marker, surrounded by drawings of motorcycles that were impressionistic in their accuracy but entirely unambiguous in their enthusiasm. They ate in the backyard, Danny's personal kingdom, the fence still bearing the marks of his empire-building childhood, the old apple tree still tilting at its characteristic angle, the grass coming back in after the winter with the determined green of something that had been through the cold and come out the other side unchanged in the ways that matter. Patch Kowalski sat in a lawn chair eating a sandwich and watching Danny show wrench the model airplane he and Tommy had built the summer before Tommy died. The airplane had been repaired 3 times. It showed it, and it also didn't. The repairs were careful and loving and had become part of the thing itself. "Good kid," Patch said to Sarah, who was sitting nearby. "The best," she said. "No qualifier necessary." Marcus sat at the picnic table with a cup of coffee and didn't say much, which Sarah had come to understand was his natural register. Not cold, just economical with words the way some people are economical with everything valuable. He'd been by once in January, with Raymond, to finalize the last of the paperwork. He'd stayed for coffee, and Danny had occupied him for 45 minutes with questions about motorcycle maintenance, to each of which Marcus had responded with the same serious, considered attention he might give a much more important conversation. Sarah had watched this from the kitchen window and thought, that is a man who understands that there is no such thing as an unimportant conversation with an 8-year-old. She sat beside him now in the May afternoon. "The hotel deal fell through," she said. "Hargroves, I heard from." She glanced toward Linda Morrow's fence, a neighbor. "The Atlanta company pulled out when the acquisition timeline became complicated." Marcus said. $4.2 million. Gone. She looked at him. "Does that feel like justice to you?" He considered this in his unhurried way, looking at the backyard, at Danny holding the model airplane up to show wrench the wingspan, at the apple tree leaning in the May breeze, at Diesel hunched in patient concentration over some teaching project with Danny that appeared to involve hand gestures. "It feels like consequence," he said finally. "Justice is something else." He paused, thinking it through. Justice is a family staying in their home. That happened. He picked up his coffee. "The rest is just arithmetic." Sarah nodded slowly. She thought that was probably right. In the yard, Diesel was teaching Danny to whistle with 2 fingers, an endeavor he had undertaken with the focused commitment of a man who had decided this was the most important skill transfer happening in the state of Vermont on this particular afternoon. Danny tried it 12 times in a row, producing sounds ranging from nothing whatsoever to something resembling a small, injured bird, and on the 13th attempt produced a clear, sharp, ringing note that carried across the spring yard like a small bell. He looked up with the expression of someone who has just discovered they are capable of something they weren't before. "I did it," he shouted. The iron wolves in the yard broke into applause. Actual applause. These leather-jacketed men with their road names and their patches and their collective decades of hard roads and hard living. With the complete, genuine, unironic pleasure of people who understand that small victories are precisely what the large ones are built from, one careful layer at a time. Sarah watched her son standing in the backyard in the May sunshine, his face lit with that simple, uncomplicated joy that 8-year-olds access so easily and that adults spend their whole lives trying to find their way back to. She thought, Tommy would have loved this. And then, because she was Sarah Calloway and she had work to do and a home to keep and a son to raise and a man at Mercy General who might need someone to sit with him this week, she got up from the picnic table and went to refill the coffee. The apple tree leaned in the spring breeze. The motorcycle sat in the driveway catching the afternoon light. Danny whistled again, cleaner this time, more confident, the sound of a skill becoming a thing he owned. The iron wolves cheered.